Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Axelrod. He is director of the Human Development Center and a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Wisconsin Eau Claire. He is editor of Investigating School Psychology, Pseudoscience, Fringe Science, and Controversies. And that's the book we're going to talk about today. So, Dr. Axelrod, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
So let me start by asking you perhaps a general question. So in the book you deal with school psychology. What is school psychology exactly, and how does it relate to other subfields in psychology, like, for example, educational psychology?
hmm So, school psychology is an applied field in psychology. And so, what school psychologists generally do is provide different types of services to children or students, teachers, parents, even even administrative level types of services. So, some of the services that are most common are assessment services. Here in the United States, for example, school psychologists often lead the assessment team to make decisions regarding students and the eligibility for special education services. So, assessment is a rather large part of a school psychologist's job, but school psychologists also provide intervention. Sometimes that's direct intervention, counseling, maybe some behavior intervention work, but also school psychologists consult with others on general issues that students would experience: academic, behavior, developmental, social, emotional, all sorts of things. So, school psychologists are often consulting with teachers and administrators and parents. And then finally, I think a more recent role for school psychologists is looking at how schools can better teach and educate students. So, more of a systems level, if you will, approach to making things better for kids. So, that may be in the area of school discipline, that may be in the area of different types of curricula or learning approaches. So, school psychologists generally cover the gamut as far as things that may be expected of schools to provide students. And how is it different to other fields or other areas of psychology? Well, one is it's applied.
Mhm.
It's when you get a degree in school psychology here in the United States, and I think it's generally consistent around the world. When you get a graduate degree in school psychology, you're usually going to be working in schools
Yeah.
and working with kids and teachers and administrators and parents. It's not necessarily a research type degree, although, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this today, research plays a really important role in terms of what school psychologists do. The real neat thing about school psychology, at least for me, is it really integrates just about every aspect of the field of psychology. So obviously, child psychology, adolescent psychology, developmental psychology, learning, assessment. Those are all aspects of school psychology that sort of draw from other areas, but there are also some pretty unique areas. Learning and behavior analysis, for example, is a common area in psychology that school psychologists draw from. Certainly, like clinical psychology and counseling psychology, social psychology. It's not uncommon for us to talk about social psychological phenomena in schools. So as a field, it's really broad, and I think that's one of the real neat things about it. You mentioned educational psychology.
Yes.
So that term is often used in places outside the United States to describe essentially what school psychologists can do.
Okay.
So oftentimes you'll hear an educational psychologist is working in a school in Europe, for example, and doing this kinds of things that I described. Here in the United States, educational psychology is more of a research degree or a research field where it's looking at how do we best use the principles of psychology all of those that I've already mentioned, like development and learning and social psychology. But how do we use all of the knowledge that we have in psychology to best educate children? And in fact, if I can put a plug in, we're actually in the process of working on a book that's very similar to the school psych pseudoscience book. It's called Educational Psychology, and it's more geared toward those that are going into teacher education programs and those faculty that are teaching in teacher education programs.
And so, why do you think that such a book investigating school psychology and the pseudoscience, the fringe science, and the controversy surrounding it was needed?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. There's a lot of observational data to suggest that many of the practices that are happening in schools, either delivered by school psychologists or even delivered by others in schools, teachers and administrators. But there's a lot of observational evidence to suggest that many of those things aren't very effective, or they don't work right, or in some cases may be harmful. But there's also some empirical evidence to suggest that as well. When we look at things like how to best teach reading, there are lots of different approaches to teaching children to read. And when we sort of look at the data behind those approaches, we find that some are very effective and some are not effective at all. And so we kind of have this sense from not just what we've seen, but also what we study, that there are a lot of things that are happening in schools that, again, aren't effective and actually may be harmful. And then, as far as school psychology goes, because I have always thought, I trained as a school psychologist, almost 30 years ago. I thought, school psychologists, they're in a school setting, they're trained to use evidence and think critically and scientifically about the practices that are happening. But a few years ago, we did a study here at UW Eau Claire where we surveyed school psychologists around the state and asked them about their beliefs regarding common myths or common practices in schools and within child and adolescent psychology. And what we found was that most of the myths school psychologists were able to identify. That was really encouraging. And many of the statements that were true, because we also had some true statements in our survey, reassuringly, school psychologists were able to say, yeah, that I believe that's true. But there were a few practices, a few myths that stood out that actually the majority of school psychologists identified as true. And one of them is actually in the book, and that is children's drawings can give us a sense of a child's problems and sort of the underlying causes of their problems. And so that's something we found in our research, and I actually wrote a little bit about it in our book, and we have a chapter on it. But I was really discouraged by that finding, and what was even more discouraging, I think, was that what we found was, because we looked at school psychologists that had been trained more recently versus school psychologists that had been in the field for, say, 20 years or more. And what we found was that there was no difference in the two groups with regard to how many endorsed that particular myth as true, suggesting that even like newer school psychologists, folks that are being trained now, are still believing in practices that were commonplace 30, 40, or 50 years ago. And that was somewhat discouraging. The other discouraging finding was that the level of education didn't matter. So in the United States, you can have a master's degree in school psychology and be in the schools, but you can also have a doctoral degree, a PhD degree, and work in the schools. And so we were expecting that school psychologists with more education would less likely believe those myths, in particular this one about children's drawings. And we did not find that. We found that the same percent of people that either had the master's or the PhD believed in that particular myth. And so I think those sorts of things came out of, or really were the set the stage for this book. But I've got to give a lot of credit to my co-editor, Steve Hupp, who's written a lot on pseudoscience in psychology and pseudoscience and particularly child and adolescent psychology. And there's a movement in the applied psychology fields. So that would be school psychology, clinical psychology, and counseling psychology to really work on removing these ineffective, harmful pseudoscientific practices. And so hopefully we'll be seeing more of this type of work out there.
And what do you think makes education susceptible to pseudoscience? Are there particular factors that play a role in that?
Yes, I think there are. That Jason Travers is a researcher here in the United States, and he's referred, and others have used this term as well, but he's referred to education as a fad magnet for pseudoscientific practices. So that schools and educators are maybe more susceptible than other professionals to believing in nonsense, if you will, or engaging in pseudoscientific practices. And I think there's maybe two reasons behind that, and they're very the people's hearts are in the right place. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to vilify the educators that may be engaging in pseudoscientific practices, because I think their hearts are in the right place. I think the first potential reason is that people are looking for approaches that work, and so they're willing to try anything sometimes. And we find that, for example, in the area of autism. So, working with children with autism is very challenging. It's a very challenging proposition. Working with kids with autism, there's no overnight fix, of course, and in fact, there's no fix. It's really just teaching kids skills and managing their social emotional behavior. But the field of autism is just proliferated with these pseudoscientific practices. And so again, what I think it is it's parents and school psychologists and educators and other psychologists that are really just, they want to help. And unfortunately, sometimes the help that they are giving isn't the help that's needed. So I think that's the first reason. The second reason is there's just these antiquated ways of thinking. That we've been doing this forever, and we're going to continue to do this. The first, or I should say, the second chapter in the book is historical pseudoscience in school psychology and education, and we talk about things like dunce caps. That goes back to the Renaissance, when you look at like where dunce caps came from. And yeah, okay, we don't use dunce caps in schools today, but we still shame children, and we still use those kinds of approaches to manage behavior. And shaming kids, particularly publicly, is not only ineffective, it's also quite harmful. So I think there's this this historical, or this we've always done it kind of thinking that happens in schools, and things don't necessarily change quickly sometimes.
And in the book, you also talk about some cognitive errors and fallacies that are relevant to school psychology. Would you like to tell us perhaps about one or two of them, just to illustrate what you're talking about here?
Right. So there's a whole host of these sort of cognitive errors that we make as humans. There are also heuristics or shortcuts that we have as humans in our thinking that lead us into potentially believing things that we shouldn't believe in. But specific to like psychology or school psychology, or the practice of psychology in education, there's a few that stand out, and I'll highlight two. One is this what we call diagnostic overshadowing, and that's where we interpret presenting problems based only on previous diagnoses. So, for example, if we're working with a kid with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and we see a new behavior emerge, we don't investigate it further on its own. We just sort of say, well, that's probably because the child has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we almost like close ourselves off to understanding something in potentially a whole new way. So that's one aspect of diagnostic overshadowing. The other is failing to interpret like other potential causes. And so very similarly, if we sort of think about a kid with ADHD who may be engaging in lots of avoidant behavior, we quickly go to say, well, that's because the kid has ADHD. When in fact, well, we also know that avoidant behavior is common for kids that have anxiety. And so if we aren't open to these other possibilities, I think we can be really our assessment and our interpretation could have lots of shortcomings. The other one that I think is really important is what we call pathology bias, and that's where there's a tendency to over pathologize or even just pathologize relatively common problems. And a really good example of that is this idea of the terrible twos. I don't know if you've ever heard that term, the terrible twos. So toddlers, 2-year-olds, are sometimes difficult to manage. Parents have used the term the terrible twos to describe these 2-year-old kids that as they begin to develop language, some of the words they use don't always meet with the cooperation standards that a parent may have. So at about between 1 and 2 years of age, the child learns the word no, and they learn the impact of the word no on their parents and the environment. So if the child has a slice of cheese and is looking at the parent, and the parent says, you can't have that, the child says no and eats it. So there's this idea, though, that there's some pathology behind that these are children that are on a trajectory that may lead to more significant behavior problems. And actually what we find is that, as I'm explaining this, you're probably seeing that this is a very common problem. I'm not excusing the problem, and there's ways that parents can work with their 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds to help them become more compliant. But to suggest, for example, that behavior is indicative of a larger psychological problem is problematic. The other one that stands out, and as a psychologist, one of the areas that I work in closely is bedwetting. I work with a lot of children that wet the bed. I do a lot of research on that area, and that is a very common problem. If you look at in the United States, if you look at first grade students, so you look at 6-year-olds, roughly a quarter of all boys will wet the bed at least 2 nights a week. So hardly a unique problem, hardly a rare problem. Yet we look at bedwetting, at least in our country here in the United States, and we think, well, there's got to be something wrong with the child. There's something psychologically wrong with the child. Who would want to wet their bed every night, almost like they're doing it on purpose? And what's happened is that they're going way back to even Freud. There are these very misleading interpretations of what bedwetting is about. One interpretation is that it's the child trying to get back at the parent for harsh toilet training practices. No evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, bedwetting it can be caused, and this is rare, it could be caused by like a urinary tract infection. But really what bedwetting is it's an immature set of muscles that surround the bladder. And so at night, those muscles aren't as strong as the muscles of of peers who don't wet the bed, and so they relax enough that then the child urinates when they're sleeping. But we've over pathologized that. We've taken a problem that has a physiological cause, and we've created this psychological cause that has no support in the empirical research. So that's the pathology bias, and we see that a lot in schools as well. The examples I gave aren't necessarily school-based, but we see that a lot in schools where, for example, it's not uncommon for kids when they're learning to write and read to mix B's and D's and P's and Q's. They look so similar. Yet we've gone off the rails there, and some people would suggest, well, then that child has some type of learning disability, when in fact it's actually quite common for children under the age of about 10 or 11 to do that. In fact, it's not uncommon for people to do that even up into adulthood, where they are maybe thinking about something else and trying to write, and they maybe mix up their P's and Q's and B's and D's. So those are just two, I think, that are pretty common, at least in the practice of school psychology and clinical psychology.
Right. So earlier you referenced the historical example of pseudoscience, the dunce caps. Let me just ask you about two more. So can you tell us about the example of open classrooms?
Yeah. So I laugh at this because I grew up in outside of New York City on the East Coast of the United States, and I went to a school that had the classrooms had no walls. The walls they had actually were bookcases. Um, and what's interesting is the person who wrote that particular chapter for us, Scott Bellini, he grew up in Southern California, just near Los Angeles, and the school that he went to was the exact same way, and we're the same age. We're exactly the same age, and so I just found that interesting because I had thought, well, maybe this is something that's very specific to certain parts of the country, but no, it's not. It happened like all over the country, and it came from the idea that we should allow kids to sort of learn based on just exploring their environment, and that if we put walls up in schools, that limits the environment. And it was solely based on that theory. The theory had never been empirically supported. And in fact, the idea of open classrooms had never been studied. So nobody had ever done the research to say, well, yeah, open classrooms are actually more effective at having kids achieve compared to traditional classrooms with walls. But this is a great example of how an idea takes off, and then things go crazy pretty quickly. And what happened was schools. This happened. It started about the mid 1970s, and a lot of schools that had been built before World War II were being demolished in favor of new school buildings. And so what we saw was these new school buildings that were being built with this open classroom concept, or classrooms without walls. And as I illustrated before, it was happening on the West Coast and the East Coast and everywhere in between. What actually ended up happening is that naturally teachers complained. The biggest complaint, there were two huge complaints. The biggest one was the noise. There was so much noise that you couldn't really get the attention of the kids and teach. And the second complaint was that teachers didn't know where their kids were. So you're looking for a kid. Maybe it's time to go to the cafeteria for lunch, and you're lining your kids up, and there are 4 or 5 of them that are somewhere else, and they're in this huge space, but across the space. And so teachers found this was a problem. What schools did was they first started putting these, as I said earlier, bookcases to separate the different schools and the different classrooms. And then after that, they found that wasn't very helpful. So then they invested in temporary partitions that they would put up. And then finally today they've had to do some major remodeling of those schools, or scrap them altogether and build schools that actually had some walls in the classrooms. So there's the open classroom concept.
And what about the self-esteem movement? How did it impact school psychology?
Yeah, so the self-esteem movement's really interesting. It came from some researchers in the 70s that had found that the self-esteem of children was kind of an important thing, kind of an important concept. Interestingly enough, the definition of self-esteem has never really been clarified in 40, 50 years. The way these researchers in the 70s thought of the idea of self-esteem was, do you feel good about yourself? And so they hypothesized that if we have children, students that are feeling good about themselves, then they're more likely to do better in school. And again, there was no evidence of that whatsoever. Um, so what happened was there was this self-esteem movement. Now, some of it also came out of the sort of self-help movement that was like the late 60s and early 70s, where adults who were sort of feeling the pressures of everyday life, the advice to them was, really work on yourself and become, the best person you can be, and feel good about yourself. And so there was some of that influence as well. What happened was that schools and school districts and states caught sort of wind of this idea that if we just boost kids' self-esteem, will impact their learning. In fact, the state of California spent millions of dollars in the 70s to revamp their curricula to include self-esteem programming. And now that we were seeing that schools were adopting these sort of self-esteem programs, we were able to look at the relationship between self-esteem and student achievement. And we found that either there was no relationship, or that there was a negative relationship, so that as kids' self-esteem was going up, their academic achievement was going down. The intended purpose of the self-esteem movement, at least in schools. The other thing that we learned was that when we started to look at different groups of people, different groups of kids and adolescents that had high self-esteem, we learned that the kids who had high self-esteem were not the kids we wanted others to be like. So, for example, kids that were gang members, they were reportedly had the highest levels of self-esteem, whereas then kids that were in music and art extracurricular activities, they tended to have the lowest self-esteem. But again, the definition of self-esteem was never really settled on. So, how we even interpret that is up for grabs.
Right. So that is about historical examples. Let's now go through some of the domains, let's say, that you cover in the
Hmm.
book with your co-authors that
Yeah.
are more contemporary.
Hmm.
So, what are zero tolerance policies and do they work?
Hmm. So zero tolerance policies there's different ways to sort of look at zero tolerance policies, at least in the United States. We're starting to see zero tolerance policies pop up in other parts of the world. In fact, I was at a conference this summer in Latvia, and there was some researchers talking about zero tolerance policies. And so essentially what zero tolerance policies are school-wide discipline approaches where if you violate the school discipline policy once, you're done. That you're suspended. So there's zero tolerance for misbehavior. Now, in theory, that there's some good ideas there, that kids that may be dangerous, um, in a school environment, or kids that repeatedly violate school rules, that may not be the best setting for them. And so they're in the United States, we have alternative schools, or if a student has some significant psychiatric problems, then there's residential programming for those kids. So again, in theory, this kind of makes sense. And again, I don't know if I would say we'd want to expel the child. We would just want to look for alternative placements for those kids. Where the zero tolerance goes off the rails is when we have a blanket statement or a blanket rule for everybody that if you engage in these behaviors, you're out of the school. And so there's just lots of these examples where zero tolerance policies are almost ridiculed. So, for example, there's an example of a student, a first grader, brought a butter knife to school to butter something, or to put cream cheese on a bagel. I don't remember the exact specifics. And had no history of disciplinary problems before this, but because the first grader, brought a little butter knife to school, he was expelled. There's another example of a child, a young student, first, second grader, who was using a pen or a pencil as a play gun, so choo, 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 like that kind of thing. And that kid was expelled for that behavior. Now, I'm not suggesting that was an appropriate behavior, but I would argue that expelling that child for that behavior is probably extreme. What we find in terms of the research is really a couple of things. The first is that zero tolerance policies don't reduce problems in schools. I think that's the most important. I think the second most important aspect is that zero tolerance policies affect students disproportionately, meaning students of color tend to be affected by zero tolerance policies more so than white students. And that's a problem. And then the third issue is that schools that have rather extreme zero tolerance policies also have poor school climates and cultures, meaning students, when there's really extreme zero tolerance policies, students don't feel good about their school.
Right. So now, to get into a more delicate subject, suicide is one of the leading causes of death among teens. So what are the most common misconceptions about it, and that would apply to a school context? And in this particular case, do prevention programs work or not?
Right. Yeah, that's good. I think the biggest myth that I see schools and school personnel perpetuate is the idea that talking about suicide will cause suicide. And so what that leads to in practice is we're just not going to talk about it. When in fact, kids have questions. Younger students have questions about what is it. Older students oftentimes have questions about, the services or programs that might be available for kids that are thinking about suicide. So for me anyway, I think that the biggest misconception in schools is the idea that if you talk about suicide, it'll cause suicide, and there's no evidence of that whatsoever. The other piece, and it gets to your question about prevention and thinking about intervention, generally speaking, universal suicide prevention programs are not effective. So when we sort of look at the programs that exist, that are delivered to all students, what we find is that they're just not enough to decrease the rates of suicide among kids and adolescents. And when you think about that might not be that surprising, because you're targeting a large group of kids, many of whom have no issues with suicide whatsoever. And you're not doing enough, perhaps, for those kids that may be at risk for suicide. And so what's recommended in schools is a is a couple things. One is maybe not necessarily a universal suicide prevention program, but rather a universal, meaning delivered to everybody, um, social emotional learning program. So focusing on skills like resiliency, friendship, um, managing your emotions when you're angry or upset or frustrated or disappointed or sad. So something of that nature that's not focused just on suicide. In
Yeah.
fact, doesn't emphasize suicide in the programming, but rather, how do you become a resilient person, and how do you ask for help, and how do you develop positive relationships with peers, and how do
Yeah.
you manage those emotions when they're really intense? And what we find is actually those programs are quite effective for kids. And I'm saying delivered universally, so they're delivered to all kids. So I would advocate for that, coupled with a really good screening program to be able to identify kids who are at risk for suicide and then funnel them to programs or services that we know are effective. And a lot of times those are going to be more in the category of individual therapy or maybe even inpatient hospitalization, for example. But the point is, we need to have screening practices that are able to identify those kids as early as possible. And we're starting to get better at not just the implementation of those screening programs, but just finding screening programs that are effective at identifying those kids that need to be identified.
And what about other less extreme risk behaviors, like, for example, alcohol use, tobacco use, risky sex behaviors,
Mhm.
and the prevention practices associated with them? What are some of the main problems with that?
Right, right. So I think that that's again something that what we've found is that there are these programs that exist and these well, there's two sort of examples here that I'll provide. The first is programs that have been in place for a long time, and nobody's willing to really take a deep dive into the data and make decisions about whether these programs are effective or not. Here in the United States, there's a program called DARE, and it's a drug and alcohol prevention program. It was designed to be delivered by law enforcement officers, which may be the
Mhm.
like the first part of where it went wrong. Um, and it was really a program designed to do two things. One is teach the some of the negative effects of drugs and alcohol, particularly long-term use or abuse. So like teaching the long-term negative impacts, and then, and this may sound silly to people who aren't from the United States or don't know DARE, but encourage kids to just say no. And in fact, that was Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan's wife, President Reagan's wife in the 80s. That was her big thing. Her campaign was just say no. So it was these two parts. One is like, okay, here's all the negative effects of drugs and alcohol, and then because of those negative effects, you should just say no.
Mhm.
And it was implemented starting in the 80s. I'm a little too old to have gone through a DARE program as a kid myself, but I've seen the DARE program being implemented. What we found in the research was that it just wasn't very effective. In fact, what it actually did was when we did pre-post tests, we found that use actually increased slightly after the delivery of a DARE program. Why did it persist? Well, some suggest maybe there was some political pressure. This is being rolled out by law enforcement. One idea is that nobody really rigorously evaluated it, and so all of the evidence was anecdotal. Like, oh yeah, I think it works. Like principals, school principals saying, "Oh yeah, I think it works." When in fact there was no like rigorous evaluation of whether it worked or not. So that's like one example, the DARE program. The other one is the use of infant simulator dolls in like sex education. I don't know if they have that in Europe or around the world, but essentially it's a mechanical doll that is supposed to imitate what it's like to have to care for an infant. So at certain times of the day, it's all electronic, and now with our high tech technology, it's even more incredible what they do. But at certain times of the day, the simulator doll will cry. At certain times of the day, the infants, and so the students. So these are given to high school students, and so the student then needs to sort of see, okay, do I need to change the diaper? Is it time for a feeding? And so kids are given these, teenagers in the United States are given these infant simulator dolls, and they're supposed to have them with them almost all the time for some amount of weeks. The idea is, I think, in theory, is actually not bad. Like, okay, this is what it's like to actually have a baby. It's not easy, and you can't always give the baby to your parent to care for, because they are doing that. And then actually you'd have a lot of schools would have these high school kids carry these infant dolls around with them at school. And then what do you do if you play a sport and you've got practice after school, or you play an instrument and you have lessons? And so it's again, in theory, there's some there's some interesting ways to make sense of this. The problem is, it's been tried as a way to deter kids from having sex, and then one of the consequences of, well, unprotected sex could be having a baby. And so that's where that's the bottom line for these infant simulator dolls. What we find is that with or without infant simulator dolls, here, at least here in the United States, teen pregnancy rates have actually gone down. Is that what that's a function of? I don't know, but it's certainly not a function of infant simulator dolls. Here's the interesting thing about it, and it gets where I think sometimes schools need to be very careful. Obviously, these things cost a lot of money. There's a lot of technology in them, and so they cost a lot of money. And so the companies that produce these infant simulator dolls, they promote them, right? They will say in their literature, these are effective. These are the outcomes. But when you do some digging, what we find is that they're really just snake oil salesmen trying to make money off of what they believe are education's deep pockets, meaning they've got education has lots of money, and they can make money off of education. So those are two examples of those sort of the other risky behaviors and some of the pseudoscience behind them.
Mm-hmm. So now talking a little bit about cognitive assessment, IQ tests are of course very frequently used. So what would you say are the most common claims made about them that do not have much scientific support?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because in recent years, it's the research that's been published really has made for some significant changes in how we evaluate kids, particularly kids with learning disabilities. So IQ tests, cognitive assessments, they generally speaking, there's lots of different types of them, but generally speaking, they're pretty good at predicting how you'll do in school, like in a kindergarten through 12th grade school environment. But it's pretty rough. I mean, it's not going to get a fine points as well. You'll get an A and you'll get a B, and you'll struggle with math and you'll do really well with language arts, and it's not that good. It's a crude instrument. It's used to identify individuals with intellectual disability, and it's a good part of a comprehensive evaluation. When we look at children and with intellectual disability, we want to look, of course, at more than just their cognitive functioning or intelligence. We want to look at other things. Are they able to kind of care for themselves? What's their communication like? Those sorts of things. Where it became problematic, and this is not just in the United States, this was around the world, is when we started to look at using IQ tests to identify kids with learning disabilities. IQ tests do not have in them academic assessment. That's not part of a IQ test. IQ test does have vocabulary. It does have which is a predictor of learning to read or reading well, but they don't have academic assessments. Yet we use them to make decisions about kids with learning disabilities. And moreover, what was going on was we would look at subtests. So an IQ test, for example, may have 12 subtests. And what we would do is we would look at the specific subtests and make comparisons. So, you might have gotten a 6 on this subtest, but a 10 on that subtest. And what school psychology and clinical psychology was doing was they were making claims about that difference. Now, there's a couple problems. One is that there's no empirical support for a lot of what people were suggesting. In fact, they were, as I was talking earlier about the pathology bias, that sort of became a problem here, where we would say, well, you got a 10 on that subtest and a 6 on that subtest. That difference is a problem. When we'd look at the population, we'd find that 50% of the population had a similar difference. So that was a problem. The other problem is, with IQ tests, as we look at these subtests, the reliability is problematic to some degree, meaning that they're just less reliable when we start to dig down into these subtests. And so making decisions about subtests that may not have a lot of reliability can be problematic. And again, it was being used mostly for making decisions about kids and learning disabilities, when in fact we have many, many other assessments that are way more helpful at determining whether a kid is struggling academically in the school curriculum.
Mhm. So tell us now about projective drawings. What are they? How are they used? And what are some of the main unsupported
hmm
claims made about them?
hmm So that was one of the myths that we found that school psychologists were apt to believing. So the idea that
Mhm.
you can use children's drawings to make inferences about them and to understand the underlying causes of their behavior. Projective drawings and projective assessments in general. So, like the Rorschach, a lot of people are familiar with Rorschach, the Rorschach, and like inkblot tests and and drawings. They're classified as this larger group of projective assessments. And so the idea there is that we want to get information from a person about their psychological functioning, and we assume that they can't tell us that information. It's not that they're nonverbal, it's that it's hidden deep somewhere inside them. And that because we can't get that information from an interview, what we can do is we can provide them with these ambiguous stimuli, for example, an ink blot, or we can ask, like a child, to draw us a picture. And from their responses, so the responses to what do you see in the ink blot, or what the child draws, we can make inferences about their psychological functioning and understand their behavior. Um, there's a couple of claims that are made about projective drawings with kids that's probably worth highlighting. The first is that they are useful in the first is that they're reliable, that the information you get from a child's drawings and the interpretations you make are reliable. And what we find is that just not is not the case. In fact, when we ask kids to draw pictures, say we ask them, a common one is the house tree person. So we ask them to draw a house, a tree, and a person. And so what we find is that when we ask the kids multiple times over the course of, say, 2 weeks to draw those pictures, they draw different pictures. And so the conclusion is that maybe it's not necessarily a psychological trait that you're assessing, but rather just sort of what they're thinking in that moment, right? More of a state characteristic. The other thought, one of the other examples is that if a child draws a heavy line, like a dark line, it suggests aggression. And there's no evidence of that whatsoever, that you can have kids that draw dark lines and light lines, and that there's no meaning in that necessarily, unless the kid makes meaning of it. The other claim is that these projective drawings, these drawings that children make, are useful in diagnosis. And they are not. In fact, there was a study that was done in the mid 70s, this is a good example of where we have good research that comes out, but people ignore it. A study was done in the 70s where they had children who had psychological disorders draw pictures, and they had children that did not have psychological disorders draw pictures. So they had two sets of pictures, the psychological problems and the non-psychological problems. And then they had experts in projective drawings look at both sets blind. They didn't know which picture went with which category, and then they had hospital secretaries look at the pictures. So people who are not experts. And what they were to do is, when they looked at a picture, they were to say, yes, this child has a psychological disorder. They didn't have to say what psychological disorder. They just had to say, yes, this child has a psychological disorder, or no, this child, based on their picture, does not have a psychological disorder. And you see where this is going, right? The experts, they had about a 45% hit rate. So less than 50% of the time, they were accurate in identifying whether the picture was drawn by a kid with a psychological disorder or without a psychological disorder. The hospital secretaries, 67% of the time, they were correct. So, are these projective drawings useful for diagnosis? No. In fact, how we even interpret these is up for a lot of debate at this point. Now, I will say we can ask in a school or a clinical setting, we can ask kids to draw pictures as part of a rapport building, but using the content of those pictures to make inferences is problematic.
Mm-hmm. So let's tackle now a very common one: learning styles. I mean, is there any evidence at all for the existence of different kinds of learning styles?
Yeah, that's a really good one. And here's one of the reasons why I'm assuming there's sort of an international audience here. This is not a pseudoscientific idea that's specific to the United States. Probably like the open classrooms, for example. There was a study that was done, and I'm looking at the number. I want to get the percent right. So looking at whether you use learning styles. So let me just take a step back. What learning styles are. So it's the idea that you learn best visually, auditorily, kinesiology, like in terms of touch, tactily. And so that based on your style, your preferred style, that's how you should be taught. So if your preferred style is visual, then seeing lots of things is going to be more effective in terms of your learning. So let me just say just how widespread this belief is. So if you look at teachers in the United Kingdom, because they surveyed teachers and they asked, do you use learning styles in terms of understanding your students and preparing lessons for them? Just under 3/4, just under 75% said yes, they do. And that's been replicated around the world in terms of teachers' use of learning styles. Here in the United States, you've got almost 30 states actually in their teacher education standards put learning styles needs to be taught to students. I mean, that's, you talk about a major problem. That's a major problem. The research is very, very clear. The use of learning styles, it does not matter one bit in terms of effective teaching. In fact, it's best to provide kids with multiple mediums in terms of the content, so they should be able to hear it and see it and manipulate it. That tends to be the most effective way to teach. And saying that, well, we if we know a kid's preferred learning style, or the learning style that maybe we think is preferred, and using that only as the only mechanism by which we teach that child, we're actually going to do harm there, because we know that a combination of approaches is most effective.
So let me ask you now about motivational theories. I mean, what are motivational theories, and what are some of the most common misconceptions and myths about them in a school context?
Right. Yeah, there's lots of motivational theories, and we could probably spend our whole time together talking about motivational theories. One of the common motivational theories is self-determination theory, that we're motivated to engage in different things in order to fulfill some sort of goal. I mean, it's very similar to what goal setting theory is, very similar there. So there's lots and lots of motivational theories. What's relevant for schools and education and working with kids and adolescents is this idea that we have this dichotomous notion of motivation in terms of intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is that internally you're motivated to engage in a behavior or complete a task. External motivation is that it's external. You're getting something to do the task, right? So, I go to work, Monday morning, and I really love my job, and I get a lot of reinforcement from my job, but I also get paid to come, right? And so the idea for in the world of schools and with kids is that intrinsic motivation is valued over extrinsic motivation. In fact, if we extrinsically motivate kids by giving them rewards, for example, for their performance or effort, that we actually may be harming their intrinsic motivation, thereby creating problems as they, get out of school and have to do things where maybe they aren't extrinsically motivated. The first problem with this whole line of thinking is that nobody's really studied the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation as actual theories of motivation. In fact, nobody's really clearly defined these two terms. If you look in the literature, there's going to be lots of references to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, but people define them very differently. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, especially with intrinsic motivation, how do we know? Like, how can we look into somebody and see that they're intrinsically motivated? And I would argue the same with extrinsic. Like, you either do the task or you don't. What are we looking for in terms of this intrinsic and extrinsic thing that exists? And so there's lots of questions professionally and scientifically about, like, where do these things actually lie? Like, how do I actually measure intrinsic motivation? And then third, this whole idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation came from a study that was done in 1973. They gave children the task of drawing something. So they were doing some art, if you will. And what they said, they had two groups. In one group, they said, just draw. The other group, they said, draw, and then how much you have on the page will determine some kind of reward. So there was this like promise for a reward. And what the researchers found was that the kids that were told to just draw produced way more content than the kids who were told, if you just draw this much, you'll get a reward. In fact, they just drew that much. Nobody went above and beyond. And so based on that one study, there was this idea that was promoted that intrinsic motivation is better than extrinsic motivation. And in fact, extrinsic rewards can harm kids' performance. Now, it's one study. The kids were told ahead of time what the standard was, and that if they met the standard, they'd get the reward. They weren't told anything about going above and beyond the standard, meaning perhaps they got more if they produced more, right? If they drew more on the page, they'd get more of the reward. That was not part of this whatsoever. And so there's a lot of questions about, coming up with conclusions about one type of motivation being better than the other based on one study that largely hasn't been replicated. And in fact, research comes out pretty regularly that suggests that when we do reward kids for particularly effort, their effort improves. And we know that when we reinforce kids' behavior, that the behavior increases in its frequency or quality. So there's like all this other research out there that really supports the idea that, rewarding kids isn't harmful at all. Yet there's this idea that rewarding kids is harmful. And it comes from a couple of well-spoken proponents of doing away with rewards in schools or doing away with rewards with kids. In fact, I presented at a conference a couple of years ago. These were all family social service workers, so like social workers and counselors, and the keynote speaker was talking about kids or people are punished by rewards. Again, not citing any research, and although he did suggest that in businesses, when companies reward employees, the employees' performance goes down. He made that claim in the talk. Now, one of the great things about having a computer in your hand at a conference is you can Google something. So I, of course, Googled rewards, business performance, something like that. I think I had 3 terms. And then I put research at the end. So I had 4 things in my Google search. And it came back, the first 3 things that came back were meta-analyses indicating that businesses that reward performance or effort actually see an increase in employee productivity. So of course, I didn't raise my hand and say, "Hey, I got something here for you." But that person was speaking to an audience of about 500 people and was speaking very well. And my guess is that 499 people in that audience left believing that rewards are harmful for children, when in fact sometimes that's what we have available to us. Not every kid goes to school and is willing to behave the best they can, and so the alternative is we provide reinforcement. And I would advocate that the rewards or the reinforcement should be acknowledgement. They don't always have to be pieces of candy, but certainly attention and praise and those kinds of things are important, as well as not just rewarding performance, but also rewarding effort. Like I see you worked really hard at that. I know you didn't get all the questions right, but your effort is something that I noticed. Great job.
Great. So let me just ask you 2 more general questions here before we wrap up. So what would you say that teachers, educators, and even school psychologists can do with all this information? How can they apply it?
Right. That's a great question. That's the like what so what's the point of all this, right? And so I
Mhm.
think there's a few things. I think the first is um certainly taking the pseudoscientific practices, the fringe science that we present, and reevaluating their own practice, right? So for
Yeah.
school psychologists or teachers or administrators or anybody who any of those topics that are relevant, that they evaluate their own practices with kids and adolescents in a school context. I think that's the first thing I would say is important. The second thing is taking a deep, a real deep look at the practices that occur in schools and asking why are these pseudoscientific practices continuing. Um, there's a researcher, Ioannidis, who came up with the term self-correction and suggested that psychology is not very good at self-correcting, meaning practices continue despite research coming out that dispel the veracity or validity of those practices. Medicine is very good at self-correcting. Like we don't, we don't have leeches anymore when we have a suspected disease. Science in general, like physics, is really good at self-correcting. Um, Newton came out with his, laws of motion and his theories of gravity, and then Einstein came around later and added to that. But it made everyone sort of rethink things. And psychology is not so great at that. We've been able to, over a century, determine that much of what Freud promoted is not scientifically supported, yet Freud lives on in our textbooks, in our teaching, and our practices. So I think what educators and school psychologists and school administrators can do is, again, take a deep look at the practices that you're engaging in currently and evaluate them. Understand, okay, is this does this work, and evaluating them in a rigorous way, not just, well, what does the research say, but also what's happening in my classroom or what's happening in my school or what's happening with my practice when I evaluate what I am doing. And then the third thing I think that's really important is advocacy, advocating for the use of evidence-based practices in schools. We have a chapter in the book on developmental disabilities,
Yeah.
neurodivergence, and specifically that these dubious practices that are used with kids with autism.
Mhm.
And so we need to advocate for the use of evidence-based practices, and it can be sometimes a difficult position to put yourself in, because these things have been going on for a long time, or people are very passionate about what they're doing, and I think we still need advocates in those places to promote effective evidence-based practices. So I think those are the things I think that teachers and educators can really do, and school psychologists. And then finally, I presented on this just recently, and I talked a lot about just being critical thinkers. I think that's important, and being conscientious of those cognitive biases, those cognitive errors that we make, and the heuristics that we practice. Being aware of those and checking those biases that you may have as you're evaluating evidence for different practices that happen in schools.
Mhm. But because we're always learning new things about everything related to school psychology, I mean, new knowledge is always getting developed and stuff like that. What are the most reliable sources for school psychologists, teachers, parents, and other people that might be interested in this topic?
Yeah, that's a really, again, I think about that question. I think we could do a whole session just on that. But to boil it down, I think the most reliable sources generally are if I think about research, it's research that comes from peer-reviewed places. So the journals, books, conferences where there's a review process, a scientific review process in place that is able to one, provide feedback on the research, but also screen. But that doesn't mean there's going to be nonsense that's promoted in these places. Not all journals are created equally. Not all fields are created equally. So I think it's not necessarily just the sources that are important, but it's training yourself to have this sort of healthy skepticism.
Yeah.
And as you begin to look at the evidence that's out there, and then the evidence could be even on the internet, but evaluate the evidence critically or skeptically. Think about how that think about what are the implications of these different types of studies. um, but also perhaps equally important is thinking about um, who's speaking about this stuff, and being very, very cautious. Now, you can be skeptical and then become cynical very quickly. So I think that, and Carl Sagan said this, it's the balance between skepticism and openness, so that when, if you've been doing something for a long time, if you're a teacher and you've been using a particular teaching approach for a long time, and you begin thinking, well, I'm a little skeptical about whether this is working, rigorously evaluate it and be open to the possibilities that rigorous evaluation may find.
Mhm. Great. So the book is again investigating school psychology, pseudoscience, fringe science, and controversies. I'm of course leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Axelrod, just before we go, apart from the book, where can people find your work on the internet?
Yeah, I think I've done a lot of research in child and adolescent psychology, particularly the evidence-based interventions. So I think in the scientific literature around school psychology, clinical psychology, and pediatric psychology, I think is really valuable. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I direct something called the Human Development Center. We are an on-campus um, clinic. So we provide clinical services to children, adolescents, and families in the community. And it's students that are actually providing the services under the supervision of credentialed faculty. So hopefully we're teaching them to use evidence-based practices. But I bring that up because you can go to the UW Eau Claire website, uwec.edu, and you can Google me and you can find a lot of the work that I've done and a lot of the work that my team has done.
Great. So, Dr. Axelrod, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and thank you for the very informative conversation.
And thank you for having me. I appreciate being here.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.